Good afternoon and welcome to our next installment in the Managerial Insight series. We are pleased you're joining us today. My name is Angie Brown and I am the Managing Director for Executive Education at the Darla Moore School of Business. The series was formed to reach our business community during this crisis to help businesses survive and emerge stronger. The series is a collaboration between Executive Education at the Moore School and the South Carolina Business Review with Mike Switzer. Mike joins us today and will be facilitating your questions at the end. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Rob Ployhart. Rob is the Bank of America Professor of Business Administration in the Department of Management here at the Moore School. Rob will be sharing his knowledge and insights on hiring in times of uncertainty. You'll be able to ask questions at the end of Rob's presentation by using the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Just send your questions along and Mike will read those to Rob and he'll be able to answer those. We are recording today's session, which will be available on our website probably tomorrow or possibly Thursday. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rob.
Okay, well, thank you, Angie, and thank you everybody for tuning in this afternoon. I'm going to switch over to share my screen here, and we will start the presentation shortly. I did want to give just a little bit of background, though. As Angie mentioned, I'm a professor here at the Moore School and have been here now for about a little over 15 years. But have been doing research in the area of staffing, hiring, recruitment, talent analytics for really over 20 years now. And most of what I'm going to be discussing today is how staffing has been changed as a result of the pandemic. But there is an element of history that's important because what we're going to see is that some of the best practices in hiring haven't necessarily changed. How we do those practices is what's changed. So I've shared my screen and we're basically going to go through a series of topics relating to hiring in the pandemic. And then, as Angie mentioned at the end of the session, there'll be plenty of time for questions along the way. So let me start by just giving you a highlight of where we're going to be going. When you routinely hear we're living in unprecedented times. I think that's been true for most of us in our lifetimes, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn something from the past. And so I wanted to start by discussing what we already know about hiring and what best practices are continuing to be best practices even as the pandemic unfolds. Then we're going to transition to look at how the pandemic has impacted hiring within these last few months. And then I want to leave you with some recommendations for hiring moving forward, mainly from the perspective of the organization. But if anybody has an interest, I can also talk about how the pandemic may change job search for you as an applicant as well. So that's the big picture of what we're going to be doing. Let me start by just giving you a brief summary, which is not intended to be a lecture, but a brief summary of what we would consider to be best practices in hiring. And hiring there's a science to it. There is a process that we should follow when we're hiring, and we're going to make better hiring decisions if we follow this process than if we don't. And this is a technology, this is a procedure that's been around for about 100 years or so, and it works. Just to briefly summarize what this process looks like, hiring should always start by understanding what are the critical parts of the job, the critical tasks that need to be performed as part of the job. And from understanding those tasks, we then can understand who are the right people that are best or most well suited for that kind of work. So from understanding the job, we understand the types of ability, personality, dispositional characteristics that are necessary to perform that work well. We should seek to measure those personal characteristics using assessments that are appropriate. And we want to use a structured process, meaning that we're not making decisions in an arbitrary way. We're not applying the assessments in a way that's inconsistent, that in fact there is a disciplined, structured process so that we can compare applicants in a way that compares apples to apples. We want to measure the effectiveness of our hiring process so that we know whether or not we're getting the kind of talent that we need in the numbers that we need them and in the places that we need them. And then finally, through this whole process, we want to ensure that candidates have a positive experience, because for many organizations, candidates are also customers. And certainly in the world we're in today, where social media and digital media is very influential and far-reaching, we want to ensure that candidates leave the hiring process, even if they're not hired, saying that they were treated respectfully and appropriately. That's positive word of mouth for the organization. So there is a fairly straightforward process that we should be following, and those practices are still true today, even though we may be in unprecedented times. However, we can look to the past to see how prior economic shocks have changed the nature of hiring as a way to gauge what we might be anticipating in the future. The most recent example of this is the Great Recession from about a decade ago. And what I'm showing you here is a snapshot of some data that a former doctoral student and I conducted, looking at about 360 different firms and following them before the recession, when the recession hit, and afterwards. And what these data show, and don't worry too much about trying to make sense out of all the lines in here, but what the data show is that if we can look at firms in terms of how selective, how rigorous they hired, and how much they trained employees, both before, during, and after the recession, we can see a couple of patterns that really stand out. First of all, not surprisingly, firms that better staffed and trained generated greater productivity and profits. And that was true before and after the recession. But what's more interesting is that firms that ramped up their hiring after the recession recovered from it more quickly than firms that didn't invest in hiring. And that's a really important point, because that's a question that's facing many firms today. Given all of the uncertainty and what's happening around us, is now a time where I should be hiring or not? Most of the research that I've conducted, as well as that I've seen, suggests that this is exactly the kind of time where hiring may matter the most, provided that the organization has the resources to do it. And we can talk more about that later. Furthermore, we see that training, which is where a lot of firms may think they want to focus more on their existing workforce and maybe train them or cross-train them to fulfill more roles. Actually, what we found in this study and several others is that training was more impactful when the economy is more stable, not after these major economic shocks like we're dealing with today. So the takeaways from the past, as we think about the future, are that one, now is the time to be thinking about hiring and doing it in a way that's strategic. And then second, that of all the times that hiring makes a difference in an organization's ability to compete, what you're doing or not doing right now is probably having a disproportionate impact on your ability to weather the uncertainty moving forward. There's a quote from many years back, the CEO at the time in the 80s, when the US government was loosening its regulations around banking. The CEO for Bank of America said, nobody really knows what's going to be happening moving forward, so the safest thing you can do is bet on talent. And that's not his exact quote, but that was the gist of what he was saying. And I think that's what these data represent here, is that in an unknown future, the safest thing you can likely do is bet on attracting and hiring people who have the capabilities to flexibly apply the organization's strategy, whatever that might be. So from the past, we can start to understand what's happening around us today. So what has the pandemic changed with respect to hiring and recruitment? First of all, if you've been paying attention to the news, you'll know that it's dramatically changed the supply and demand in some industries. We've seen the frontline retail, most of the food service, quick service industry, restaurants, and so on. Those have obviously been hit very heavily. Their reports are all over the map. Some regions don't seem to be as badly affected as some others. I saw one report, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but claims that in the Myrtle Beach area, about half of those customer contact hospitality jobs may be gone, or at least are gone right now. On the flip side, we see areas where there's an abundance of demand. Anything that's relating to shipping, some warehouses, Amazon distribution types of places like that have seen quite a bit of demand. All of these, of course, are going to have some timeline to them where the supply and demand starts to change, but we have seen some disruptions. What we've also seen is that the pandemic has changed applicant preferences in terms of what kind of work they're looking for. And then finally, most employees that were or are looking for work in customer contact or face-to-face kinds of jobs are looking for opportunities that involve less physical interaction, both in work, and that's having some consequences in hiring. So that's the big picture. Let me show you some examples more specifically of how the pandemic has changed hiring. Oh, my little visual here before I forget. The takeaway, we have this nice little linear process. The pandemic has really disrupted almost every piece of that for many organizations. So how has the pandemic changed hiring? A few minutes back, I showed you a slide that showed what happened in the Great Recession. And here I'm showing you a similar kind of slide where this vertical line right down the middle with the little COVID-19 image there is showing where the pandemic hit. Let me clarify when I say hit. It's when the World Health Organization officially listed and noted the COVID-19 as a global pandemic. So what these data represent, and these are data, and the slide is courtesy of a consulting firm called Harvard, which is a firm that some colleagues and I here in the Morse School have been doing research with, trying to understand the nature of this pandemic and hiring. So what we're looking at are job applications, average job applications since January of this year until late April. And the blue line represents, the blue line right here, represents the average number of weekly job applications for organizations that primarily are hiring in work from home types of jobs. So you can think of this blue line as being the average number of job applications in work for home kinds of jobs. The yellow line represents the average number of weekly job applications for companies that are face-to-face jobs. And so on the axis over here along the right-hand side of the screen, these are the average number of job applications face-to-face, and on the left-hand side, average number of applications work for home. Now, don't worry too much about what the raw numbers refer to. Focus more on the trends. What we see is that in the time period before the recession, the onset of the pandemic, the time period of January, February, and March, what we see is that seasonal hiring was starting to slow down. We come back out of the holidays, and the hiring rates for both organizations the number of applications were declining fairly modestly over time. That was pretty typical. Remember, our job market up until around early March had basically zero functional unemployment, unemployment rates of around 2%. So not a lot of people applying for jobs. What we see at that time period when the pandemic was officially recognized, the COVID-19 virus was officially recognized as a global pandemic, is a pretty abrupt change in the number of applications between work for home and face-to-face types of jobs. Work for home jobs, we see actually a large increase in the number of applications that shot up in the second half of March. We're seeing numbers that doubled or tripled relative to where they were prior to the onset of the pandemic. What we see is a little bit noticeably lower number of applications for face-to-face jobs. So the takeaway from this slide is really that the pandemic disrupted hiring, applications, similar to what we've seen with the last recession, but there's one major difference. The nature of this pandemic is such that the virus is most puts people most at risk in face-to-face kinds of employment. So relative to the last recession, the pandemic has actually produced a shift in applications. It's not that every industry has been hit the same way. It's that some industries are in a situation where there's greater demand and other industries where there's less demand, less supply. And so this chart is basically showing that. What it means is that if you're an organization that offers work from home opportunities, right now you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have an abundance of applicants to choose from. And if you're in a face-to-face employment situation where the jobs, let's say, require interacting directly with customers, you're going to be in a disadvantaged situation in terms of trying to attract talent, as we'll see in the next couple of slides. So how has the pandemic changed work preferences? Again, I'm summarizing some surveys and research that we've done with the consulting firm Harvard. And what we're seeing is that applicants, those that are actually out there looking for jobs, are increasingly wanting to have jobs that offer flexibility and less physical contact, direct physical contact. Since the pandemic hit, these are data that were collected at the end of March, on a US national sample of working adults, 80% of those that were looking for work reported increased anxiety and looking for jobs relative to what they had experienced in the past. 75% said they needed additional support in finding work relative to what they had experienced before the pandemic. And a lot of this is being driven by the shift of employees from jobs or industries where they may have been working in the past and moving towards jobs and organizations that offer opportunities for either work from home or more remote types of work arrangements. Now, it's important to recognize here that when we have these kind of shifts, for example, people that want to leave working as waiters or waitresses and looking, let's say, work from home, telework or something like that. They don't necessarily have the background or the skills for that kind of work. And that's what's driving, we believe, these increases in greater job search anxiety and need for additional support. When we see the shift towards more work from home types of opportunities, it's a shift in applicant preferences, but it's really important to keep in mind that that doesn't mean that they're actually ready and able to do that work. As I mentioned, this is a pretty big shift for a lot of people. I mean, maybe this is true in your own experience, but there's certainly plenty of anecdotal stories in the media, maybe from your friends or colleagues, of people who are used to working more regular hours in an office, struggling to adjust to work from home types of environments. That's a big transition for a lot of people, and especially a big transition if you're somebody who is used to working in a very high contact type of job to one now where you're primarily working from home through a computer. So just because a firm might offer work from home opportunities doesn't mean that applicants are actually ready for it. And again, based off some of the research we've been doing with Harvard, we found that 50% of the candidates do not actually have the hardware software capabilities to be eligible for work from home kinds of jobs. What that means then is that we might have a large uptick in applications to work from home jobs, but it doesn't mean that the applicants actually have the infrastructure, the internet bandwidth, or the computer equipment to be able to do work from home types of jobs. Likewise, a lot of them don't have the necessary skills, the right personality characteristics, the right, say, self-discipline that might be necessary to effectively work from home. The other issue here is that not all access to the internet is evenly distributed. And so people that live in more rural areas, people who live in more economically disadvantaged areas, and also people who are from more traditionally disadvantaged groups, whether that be racial minorities or women, tend to actually have less internet access or lower quality internet access. And what that means, again, as an employer, is that they may have the skills to be able to do the work, but don't necessarily have the infrastructure or computer hardware to be eligible to do the work. And so you're actually potentially losing qualified people, access to qualified people, not because of job characteristics or their ability to work, but purely because of hardware and software. And it's something to think about. And we'll talk about this again as I give some recommendations looking forward. So the point is, the pandemic in many ways follows the examples we've seen in prior recessions, but there's also some important differences. And the biggest difference we've observed so far is that candidates have a much greater concern about their health and safety. And so as a result of that, are looking for more flexible and work from home types of options. So what does that mean then moving forward into a post-pandemic world? And I think we're starting to enter that world now, as we've seen a lot of states begin to ease up their lockdowns, and we transition into some form of hybrid normal work. I think there's a few big takeaways that we've seen pretty consistently in the data that we've been reviewing. First of all, there is a large increase in candidates who want less physical contact. That's particularly true in customer-facing jobs, and I think that's also showing up even in your more typical office, colleague-to-colleague kind of setting. So less physical contact is key. There's a large unevenness in both the supply and demand for talent right now. And as I mentioned at the beginning, in some industries, in some locations, talent is still in very high demand, and it's hard to find the people you're looking for. And then in other areas, there's a really big surplus. And all of this really comes down to concerns of relating about health, safety, and security. And I'm gonna give you an example of how this is playing out. So you've probably seen in the media, there are different opinions on the extent to which companies are enforcing policies about masks, both for their own employees and customers. And I'm giving you two examples here. Costco, fairly early on, required everybody to wear a mask as a company-wide policy. On the other hand, you've probably seen in the media, I don't know who the organization is, but one in Kentucky that basically put up a sign that said, "You're not allowed in my business if you're wearing a mask." So that tension that sits out there is putting the frontline employee into a very, very difficult and occasionally dangerous situation, as we've seen in some instances, employees even being physically abused or in a couple cases killed as a result of this. So when I'm talking about health, safety, and security, I'm talking about something that really is fairly unique to the situation we're dealing with now. As there's so much division in the country about how we handle this pandemic, it's really the frontline employee that's being put into the middle of all this and trying to navigate it. And that means that for an organization that's trying to differentiate itself from competitors in a way that you can hire the best talent, you have some choices, some levers at your disposal that you can implement here and pull as a means to increase the odds that you get the talent that you need and want. So let's talk about what some of these options might be. The first thing that I would recommend is that we're in a situation where people are concerned about their safety and reluctant to put themselves into direct physical contact. And I know that's not universal, and I realize that differs a lot by geography, but on average, that's a lot bigger concern than it's been in the past. So for an organization that wants to be in tune with those concerns, the first thing I would say is you're going to have to move past maybe your old way of hiring, which was much more direct and face-to-face, and really push more of a virtual digital presence than you might have in the past. In my world, we would call these things realistic job previews, but what you really want to do is to provide an accurate, realistic view of your organization using digital media. So whether that's on your website or using social networking sites like Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever, you do want to put out fairly accurate representation of what your organization is like, its culture, its people, and the nature of the work. And I think that always works best when you have actual employees giving a reasonably accurate description of what their job is like and what it's like to work in that organization. If you already have that digital presence, fantastic. If you don't have it, now's the time to do it, because you're responding to the concern of applicants that they don't necessarily want to have to go in face-to-face yet into an organization. Okay, the second thing, and this one has been true forever, but I think it's even more important now, test and screen your candidates before interviewing. There's a whole variety of well-developed, professionally sound, technically and legally appropriate assessments that can be used. And as an organization, you're leaving money on the table if you're not using them. That's the bottom line. These can be fairly simple, such as tests about prior experience or knowledge. They can be more sophisticated, where we may be looking at personality characteristics or measures of more basic of ability, creativity, and so on. The point is, those principles that I mentioned on the second slide are still relevant today. What do you need to do the job, and what are the important characteristics that people must have to do that work well? Well, if we know that people need to have, for example, knowledge of a particular kind of software, then we can screen for that. If they need to have, let's say, a particular constellation of personality characteristics, we can screen for that as well. Don't use just anything that's out there. Use professionally developed appropriate assessments, but those assessments not only help you make better hiring decisions, they respond to a big need right now among candidates, which is a lot of them are reluctant to put themselves into a potentially risky health situation. So these assessments that I'm talking about are assessments that can be done online, on digital devices, personal devices. Not only will you make better hiring decisions, you're improving the candidate experience by being responsive to their concerns about health and safety. Third recommendation, you're probably going to still use some kind of an interview. Now is the opportunity to move the interview to the modern era if you haven't already done so. I'll give you some specific recommendations in a second, but to put it simply, for jobs that are important but not necessarily critical, virtual interviewing is probably the way to go. Again, it responds to candidates' concerns about health and safety, wanting flexibility, wanting to minimize physical contact. And if you do the virtual interview appropriately, you're going to get about the same quality that you would face-to-face. For critical jobs, those that are maybe more strategically valuable, I don't think you can actually get past the in-person interview. I think that's still an important part of the experience, both for the organization and for the candidate. The key there is to ensure that you do that towards the end, and that you ensure it's done in an environment that minimizes health and safe risks. Finally, throughout this entire piece of the hiring process, pieces of the hiring process, make sure you do it in a way where you're tracking results and you're monitoring the candidate experience. Again, candidates have more impact today than they've ever had in history, and the reason is because of social and digital media. So you want to ensure that the candidates that you're interviewing, the candidates that are applying to your organization, are in fact feeling like they've had they've been treated respectfully and appropriately. Again, these people spread word of mouth, but they also are your potential customers. Okay, so if one of the recommendations is to use virtual interviews, how do you do that well? Well, the good news is you do it in a lot of the same ways you used to do it, which means you should use a structured process. But there are some additional issues to consider with virtual types of interview processes. There's a lot more preparation. First of all, explain the expectations to candidates about what the virtual interview is going to require. That means, what kind of hardware and software are they going to need? Are they going to need a camera and a video capabilities and so on? Explain to them how the process is going to work just procedurally, what the expectations are. For example, sometimes if you've ever seen virtual interviews, people make some interesting choices about whether they think they still need to dress appropriately or not. If you want to increase the quality of your interview, clarify your expectations to the candidates. If you expect them to be professionally dressed for it, even though they're doing it from their kitchen, then tell them that. Why leave so many unknowns? The other part is to ensure the hardware readiness. As I mentioned before, a lot of people that apply for work for home jobs aren't even eligible for them because they don't have the hardware capabilities. Tell candidates what kind of hardware they're going to need to be able to participate in the interview. And then train the hiring manager or the interviewers. What types of expectations should they have? Provide to them the way that the process needs to be administered and how that process should be administered the same way to everyone. And that leads to my second point, the implementation piece. Make sure that you use structured questions. All candidates ask the same questions the same way is the only way that you can ensure you're comparing apples to apples. And to put it simply, structured interviews are going to be the most predictive, have the least amount of bias, and are going to give you the greatest return on investment than any other interview approach that you can use. There's no good reason not to use structured interviews. You may have heard people that say interviews can't tell you anything about a candidate. If you've heard that, then I would say they've not been using structured interviews in the manner in which we would develop them professionally. The last issue here is to remember that your talent pool may not have equal access to participate in a virtual interview, which means you need to provide some alternatives for people who may not have the hardware necessary or may not have the internet capability that they need. The digital divide is a term that's used to describe the fact that people from disadvantaged backgrounds tend to have poor quality internet access. And so if your internet access needs are too high, you're most likely screening out people who could do the work, and the people you're screening out are most likely from disadvantaged backgrounds, which can get you, of course, into issues about the legality of your hiring practices because they're not equal access. So the important point here is this, that you give everybody an equal opportunity to perform. Doesn't mean that you change the hiring standards for different people. It means they have equal access, equal opportunity. Okay, last point is some cautions to think about. One, if you're in a situation where there's suddenly a large uptick in the number of applications, for example, you're offering work for home opportunities and you now see 4 times as many applications, there's going to be a strong temptation to make the hiring process more selective. Well, if in the past we had an expectation of 5 years of experience, now we want 10 years of experience. Remember that each of those choices should be based off of job characteristics. And if you make the process more selective for reasons that are not job related, you're actually putting yourself in a legally risky situation. So keep the focus on job characteristics rather than being more selective just because you can. Second point, you really need to stay in front of the digital media and the message that you're sending out because you don't have the opportunity for as much face-to-face interaction as we did just a few months ago. Likewise, you're going to have to do a much more proactive job of managing the multiple stakeholders and their very divergent opinions about the pandemic. Masks are an easy one to see because it affects us all around and there's so many different opinions on it. But we're talking about what's an appropriate health risk, what's not, how much work can be done from home versus must be done in an office. We're in an uncharted territory about how much opinion and opportunity people have to engage in different work types of settings. And so as an organization, you really need to understand those opinions and try to manage and make sense of them. I'm just going to say on this next point, avoid the temptation to hire using social media. Use social media to recruit. Use social media to attract people to apply to your organization. But when it's time to make hiring decisions, use professionally developed, appropriate practices. Don't go to Facebook to look for people to hire. It's a legal risk that, in my opinion, from what I've seen from actual evidence, rather than people's anecdotal stories, the actual evidence suggests people make really poor hiring decisions using social media. And in my opinion, probably in a way that's illegal many times. The last point, train your hiring managers, train your interviewers on this new reality. measure the effectiveness of your practices, and document the approaches that you're using so that you know what actually works and what is not working. So with that, I'll just say thank you for listening. Here's my contact information, which you're more than welcome to reach out to me if you have any reactions, suggestions, questions, and so on. But with that, I will drop off here and with my part of the presentation and open it up for questions.
So thank you very much, Rob. And just a reminder to everybody, if you have a question, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and we will get those questions relayed over to Rob. Rob, those were a lot of great recommendations, and I'm going to assume that you've had a lot of conversations with real companies, real businesses, what's going on out there, and formulating all of this, and with, you know, as you mentioned, doing research with research companies as well. Can you share with us a real world example or two? You don't have to give us the company name or the business or even the industry, but if you can you just share with us a couple of real world examples on these recommendations being implemented and how they're working?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll leave the names of the companies out, but where we've really seen, I would say, the biggest, let's say, disruption, I'll just call it that, since the pandemic hit is in the frontline customer facing industries. So again, retail, quick service, restaurants, fast food, and so on. And the big change there is, one, the shutdown and how businesses handled that. And most of those organizations, I think to their credit, really did and have done a lot to try to maintain their existing workforce. They may have been home, they may have been been home without pay or with limited pay, but I'd say the organizations tried really hard to keep their staff engaged as much as they could. And for a period of time, I think everybody was pulled together around that. Where things have started to fall apart now is the unevenness to the way that the country has opened itself back up. And I think what it's done is that unevenness, that uncertainty, has created a lot of additional anxiety and stress in candidates. And so before, there was kind of like, we're all in this together, let's hang together kind of spirit. I think we're starting to see that unravel. And so to your question, how have companies handled it? Some have really gone out there to say, we're not opening back up until it's safe, and we're going to take a financial hit to that, and we think we can weather it for a period of time, and we're going to weather it as long as we can. And I think those companies have had really good retention from their staff. Our data actually suggests that employees will wait quite a while if they have confidence that the company is going to survive and bring them back, not surprisingly. But I think the bigger segment is where the companies have had to let people go. The company is closed. In those situations, it's really pushed the workforce into some new areas. You know, it leaves an impression, right? You've lost your job, you've been burned. You thought you'd have a job, you held out for the company, and it turned out to not be true. And they're really reluctant to go back to that same kind of work if they have an option, okay? So you're seeing people kind of run to other industries, other types of work where they don't necessarily have the background or experience to be qualified for it, or at least to be competitive for them jobs. And what I'm afraid is happening is that companies are missing an opportunity to really get in there and bring in some new talent who might have the capability to do the work, but they're looking just based on experience. And I've seen that in company after company where they're saying, well, look, I've got more applicants now, so I'm only going to hire people that have worked this exact same kind of job in this exact same kind of way. And I think they're missing people that might be more experienced, have greater maturity, might have more of a career type of mindset because they don't have direct experience in the occupation. So it's kind of a broad answer to your question, but it's so consistent. I see it happening over and over.
And so how about some of these companies who really need some workers right now, yeah, and who want to take advantage of, you know, this opposite of this tight labor market that we used to have? Are they offering training? Are you seeing companies that are saying, we're willing to send you through whatever we need? If we think you can handle it, we'll train you.
Right. So short answer is no on that. I've not seen a large increase in offers for training specifically, but what you do see is a greater sense that we're going to try to offer some degree of stability and security to you. For the companies that are struggling to find talent, again, they need to understand that the world has shifted around them. So just offering a job with a salary isn't the approach. Even somebody who wants a job and needs a job is looking for something more than just that. They're looking for a sense of stability and security. So to your question, can I give you some specific examples? Yeah, companies that are really using that as the leading of their recruiting effort. They may not be able to pay as competitively as they would like. They may not be able to offer even full-time employment, but what they can offer is a commitment to the employee that they're going to try to do everything they can to give them the type of work that they value in a way that meets their needs for health and safety. Work from home options again. The companies that are offering viable work from home options or flexibility, and I mean, are being very specific about it, right? You can work from home 1 day a week. You can work from home a certain percentage of time, or whatever. They're leading with that in their recruiting, and I believe they're seeing better quality hires and more hires than companies that haven't made that transition. So the principles that I was saying in the slides are really the ones that again, the specifics. Just do those things. Your recruiting starts with saying, hey, we know that you're concerned about health and safety. Here are the specific steps we've taken to make sure that those needs are being addressed.
Now, what about, health experts are pretty sure we're going to have a second, maybe even third wave of this pandemic. Anything in particular that companies should be doing right now just to get ready for that?
Yeah, so I would go back to that quote, when the future is uncertain, bet on talent. Of course, that's easy for me to say as a human resource researcher. And within the realities of an organization's financial situation, of course, but betting on talent and looking for people that have the capability to not only do the job today, but the ability to adapt and adjust to a job that will likely change in the future. That's what I would be looking for. And those are personality characteristics fundamentally. I'll give you some specific examples. Companies that are not sure what's going to happen with this pandemic moving forward are giving greater attention to hiring for a more generic set of skills, characteristics that relate to adaptability, flexibility, and so on. So it may not be the person who has the most job experience, but it's the person who has enough experience, who also has likely had a broad enough background to where they're able to contribute in other kinds of ways, depending on how the job situation, the market may fluctuate.
All right, let me remind everybody that just use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to send a question in to us. We'll get it over to Rob. And then I'd also like to remind you that on our radio show tomorrow morning, the South Carolina Business Review on South Carolina's 8 public radio stations, we will have the next chapter in this series with Professor Lynn McFarland, and the topic being leadership in a time of crisis. And then, of course, the Zoom conference back again next Monday, no holiday next week. So we'll be back at 3 p.m. on Monday. Rob, I don't see any other questions coming in, so I guess you've done an excellent job.
I hope so. Thank you.
So we'll turn it over to Angie.
Okay, thank you, Rob and Mike. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Rob's PowerPoint deck will be emailed to everyone who's registered, and again, today's session will be available on our website tomorrow or Thursday. As Mike mentioned, next week we'll welcome Dr. Lynn McFarland, also from our management department, and she'll be discussing effective leadership in times of crisis. Mike mentioned you can hear Lynn's interview tomorrow on his show. So we look forward to that. And then we'll have our live discussion next Monday, June 1st at 3 o'clock. So until then, thank you for joining us and stay well.